Hello and welcome to this video on negative externalities. In this video we're going to be looking at what the term externality means, looking at positive and negative externalities, and then we're going to be focusing mainly on illustrating what a negative externality is. So let's start off. What is an externality? Well, an externality is the effect of a decision by consumers and producers that has an impact on a third party. So whenever buyers and sellers meet in the market and decide to produce something, if that action has an impact on someone who is not a consumer or a producer, a third party, then we would say an externality has arisen. So an externality is mainly an impact on a third party. And those impacts can be positive, they can be beneficial, in which case we have a positive externality. And those impacts on third parties can also be negative, they can be costs, in which case we have a negative externality. So let's make sure we've got all of this down in our notes, and then when we're ready, we'll move on. So, externalities. So what makes sense to an individual, a buyer or a seller in a market, may have a positive or negative impact on a third party. For example, a logging company, it will make sense for them to cut down trees because they can then sell them. It makes sense for the market to produce that particular option. But if we think about a third party who might be impacted by that, well, perhaps the local community who lives in that area who suffer from the environmental damage, they didn't cut down the tree, but they are impacted upon. They would experience a negative third party effect. Let's think about the action to paint your house. So here, someone has painted their house, they've taken that decision to make their house look nice. And let's think about what might be a third party impact. Well, actually, if someone's taken the decision to paint their house a nice color, let's say this one here, how might this house over here be affected? Well, actually, if this one over here looks really nice, then the value of this one to the right might increase. Now, the value of the house increasing is nothing, it's just an impact on the person who owns that house, not the initial decision to paint the house on the left. So that would be a positive impact on a third party. Let's think about a vaccination. Let's imagine that you get a vaccination and it makes sense for you to pay for a vaccination, get vaccinated, so you can't get the disease. But actually that might also have an effect on me, a third party who hasn't made that decision to get vaccinated, because now I can't catch that disease from you. So that's a positive effect on me as a third party, thanks to you making that individual decision. Final example here might be something like fly tipping, leaving your rubbish by the side of the road. It might make sense for you to undertake that transaction, but third parties, the people who live in the area and have to deal with all the damage to the environment, and it's a bit of an eyesore, those people would feel a negative effect, would be affected negatively. So an externality is when we have a positive or a negative impact on a third party who didn't make or produce the initial transaction. So now we can use this to analyze why this concept of externalities is likely to cause market failure, is likely to give us a result from the free market, just buyers and sellers, that isn't desirable from society's point of view. And we're going to do that by looking at the benefits and the costs of these actions to a number of different groups. So we're going to be thinking about benefits in our analysis. We're going to be thinking about three categories of benefits. The first one is the private benefits. And these are the benefits that go to the individual consumers or the firms who are undertaking the economic activity, to the buyers or the sellers. And in particular, we're going to be referring to the marginal private benefit. And that means the benefits that the consumer or supplier has gained from each extra unit. That's the key. That's what marginal means. From each extra unit, how much benefit do they gain? We're also going to be looking at the benefits not to the producers or the consumers of this particular item, but to the third parties, and we call those external benefits. So these are benefits to the third parties, not the consumer or the producer. Again, we're going to be referring to marginal external benefits here, and that is the extra benefit to a third party from every extra unit produced. Finally, we're going to look at the benefits not to the producer or the supplier or to the third party, but society as a whole. So the total benefits to society of the economic activity. And that is really just if we think about society, is the producer and the consumer, the private individuals, and also the external benefit as well. So when we're thinking about those combined, give us the social benefits. We're also going to be thinking about costs. So our first category here is private costs, and these are the costs to the individual consumer or the firms from producing the good or service. And again, we'll be referring to the marginal private cost, which is the cost of producing each extra unit. We're also going to be considering the external costs. These are the costs to third parties. And again, we'll be thinking about the marginal external cost, so the cost of third parties from each extra unit produced. If we take the external costs and the private costs and add them together, then we get the social cost, the total cost that's being incurred to society of this particular activity. So with these concepts in mind, we can now start to put together our analysis to illustrate why these externalities are likely to give us market failure. And we're going to focus here on the concept of a negative externality, so where there are negative effects on a third party. So the first thing we recognize is that we're going to look at the buyers and sellers within the market. And we're going to first of all talk about the benefits. So here we have the private benefit or the marginal private benefit. So what this shows us is that for the first unit produced, we have quite a high benefit to the consumer or the producer of that particular unit that's being produced. It's the first one. If you imagine that here we're talking about chopping down trees, for example, the first tree that we chop down, people are likely to attach a high value to that. It's likely to be able to command a high price. By the time we've chopped down our millionth tree, actually everyone who's got one, wanted one, has got one, and actually we'd only get a lower price, a lower value, a benefit for that millionth tree produced. So here we have a downward sloping curve that illustrates the benefits we get from chopping down trees. It also equals the marginal social benefits here, but we'll come on to that in a second as to why that's the case. So we've got the private benefits. We're now going to add in the private costs. Now, if you think about it, in terms of the cost, which tree would you chop down first? Would you chop down the tree that's cheap to chop down? Or would you chop down the tree that is expensive to chop down? Well, you probably start with the cheap ones, the easy ones to get. So there'd be quite a low cost for the first one, perhaps, the easy ones to chop down. But by the time you've chopped those ones down, increasingly you get harder and harder to maybe climb to the top of the hill and chop the other ones down. The cost will start to rise. So here we have two curves that illustrate the costs and the benefits to the consumers and the firms of undertaking this particular action. So if we have a look, this first tree, does it make economic sense to chop down this tree here? Well, this is the benefit that we'll get, and this was the cost of doing it. So as long as the benefits outweigh the costs, then it makes economic sense to chop that tree down. Let's have a look at this tree here. The benefit of doing it is here, and this outweighs the cost. So again, it makes sense to chop this tree down. And so on and so on and so on until we get to the situation where there is no longer a difference between the benefits and the cost of doing so, which occurs at this point here. So would the business in question chop down this tree? Well, no, because the costs here outweigh the benefits. So it wouldn't make economic sense to chop down this particular tree. So firms will keep producing until they reach this quantity of trees that have been chopped down. So let's get rid of these remarks. And so we can draw on what we would call the market equilibrium. This is the number of trees that we would get chopped down if it was just left to the buyer and seller to decide how many. And that occurs at the point where the private benefit equals the private cost. Prior to that, the private benefit was greater than the private cost. After that quantity, the private cost is greater than the private benefit, so it doesn't make economic sense to chop those trees down. Okay, now that's how many we would get chopped down, how many trees we would get chopped down if it was left to the free market. But if we think about it here, there's also going to be third-party impacts. There's going to be third-party effects on chopping down trees. If we think about it from a cost perspective, there are going to be costs to third parties of the environmental damage that's being done, maybe destruction of habitat, maybe people who live there, local communities. There will be costs to these third parties that we aren't taking into account here when we're just thinking about the logging company and the logging company's customers. So let's now consider adding in these external costs on top of our private costs. So if we're going to say this is the value of the external cost and we add it on to the private cost, then this gives us our marginal social cost. So the social cost here is the external cost plus the private cost. So here we're looking at the cost to society as a whole. Now we also need to do the same for the benefits. We need to look at the benefits to society as a whole. But we're going to assume here, we're going to make an assumption that actually there are no external benefits of chopping down trees. The only benefit of chopping down trees goes to the private consumers of those particular trees. So if there are no external benefits, then if we add on a zero amount to our private benefit, then our social benefit is just going to be the same. So here we've got the marginal private benefit, add on no external benefits, so our marginal social benefit will equal our marginal private benefit. So this curve now, this blue line, represents the social benefit as well as the private benefit. So let's go through our same analysis, but now we'll look at it from society's point of view. This first tree here, do we want this first tree chopped down? Well, here is the benefit of chopping that tree down, and here is the cost. So the benefits outweigh the costs. So we would say, yes, we do want that tree down, chopped down. What about this tree here? Well, again, the benefits up here outweigh the costs. So we would want that tree chopped down. What about this tree over here? Do we want this tree chopped down? Well, here are the costs and here are the benefits. Now the costs outweigh the benefits, so we wouldn't want this particular tree chopped down. If we continue the logic of this analysis, what we're saying is actually the socially optimum quantity, the best quantity of trees being chopped down from society's perspective would be up until this point here, up until where social benefit equals the social cost. And so this quantity here, Q SOC, is the number of trees that we would want chopped down from society's point of view. So what we can see is actually if we left it to the free market, we would get an overproduction. We would get too many trees chopped down than we want from society's perspective. So this illustrates quite nicely why the existence of external costs leads to an overproduction. The market will produce too many. The market will chop down this many trees, and from society's perspective, once we take into account all the external costs, we would only want this QSOC quantity of trees chopped down. Right, we can take our analysis one step further. We can actually try and quantify, right, well, if this quantity of trees is being chopped down, if I extend this up here, we can actually quantify the damage to society, if we like. So all these trees here are all being chopped down, and that is undesirable from society's perspective because the costs up here outweigh the benefits. So for example, that area there represents the way in which the costs are greater than the benefits of that tree that's being chopped down from society's perspective. From this tree here, here's the cost, here's the benefit, and so the gap in between represents the net, if you like, cost or net welfare that is being lost to society from chopping that tree down. If we continue to take that analysis to its logical conclusion, we would end up with an area that represents the total welfare loss to society. So if I extend this line here, and this red area here would represent the net welfare loss to society. It gives us a total of all the area where the costs outweigh the benefits from those trees that are being overproduced, chopped down, that are undesirable. So this area in here represents the total net welfare loss of that overproduction that's being taken place by the free market. So this is our final diagram. This is our negative externality diagram. It's an important diagram, so let's make sure we've got a good copy down in our notes. You might want to pause the video to do that. So here is our example. Here is our completed diagram illustrating the negative externality. It illustrates the overproduction that we would get from the market if it's just left to buyers and sellers to determine how much to produce. And also we can look at the net cost to society of that overproduction, which is represented by the green area, sometimes known as the welfare loss, deadweight welfare loss, or net welfare loss area. So a negative externality exists when the social cost is greater than the net private cost, and so the market output is greater than the socially optimum output. The free market may overproduce goods or services that possess negative externalities. A more efficient allocation of resources would be to produce where the social benefit equals the social cost, so the socially optimum output. But the free market only takes into account the private cost of production, and so we're going to get an overproduction of the goods, and we're going to get negative costs to third parties that aren't taken into account. Here are a couple of examples. So things like driving your car, it makes sense for the private individual, the benefits of getting there quicker and the costs of the petrol. But actually, if everyone thinks like that, we have all these external effects on the other drivers of slowing them down and congestion and pollution. And actually, if it was just left to the free market, often we would get too many car journeys and more than is desirable from society's perspective. Again, things like environmental damage, a very common one. Power stations pumping out gas into the environment. They don't take into account the damage they're doing to the environment. They just think of the power price and the cost of the coal or the gas that they're burning. Then again, there'll probably be too much production from that particular style of generation of power, and we will get too much, and so a negative externality will exist. So in this video, we've looked at what is meant by the term externality. We've introduced the idea of benefits and costs, positive and negative externalities, and we've looked at illustrating a negative externality, so where external costs exist. That's it. Thank you for listening.